Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.
Hello, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a podcast by the Institute for Enterprise Ethics. I'm Dan Sweeney, the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics. Today we're going to talk about stakeholder engagement in corporate social responsibility programs. Many companies are now taking a multi-stakeholder approach to planning and governing their business operation. Most are very comfortable engaging their traditional stakeholders like shareholders, vendors, employees, and customers. But many do not have the experience or the knowledge about how to engage other stakeholders, especially those that may emerge as critical in CSR programs, such as ad hoc environmental groups, community action groups, and social justice organizations. How should a corporation engage with these stakeholders? To what end and with what messages? As an environmental lawyer, operations research engineer, and public policy consultant who has worked in the environmental and transportation fields for over 35 years, James "Skip" Spensley is well equipped to help answer these questions. Skip has served twice as the governor's appointee to the Denver Regional Air Quality Council and served as manager of the new Denver Airport office responsible for the planning, development, and community negotiations that led to the construction of DIA. He has served as an adjunct professor and lecturer on environmental policy at the Sturm Law School and at the Daniels College of Business, both at the University of Denver. Skip, we had a great discussion with 20 or so experienced people in this issue of stakeholder engagement. Would you share with our audience what you think are the two or three most important factors to a successful stakeholder engagement process?
Sure. I think one of the critical items in a stakeholder engagement process is making sure that you have identified all of the important stakeholders. In the past, companies have been probably too limited in identifying who are the people that really can affect the business of the company or who are affected by what the company does. The second factor would be being able to successfully identify the interests of those stakeholders. Oftentimes, it is not always apparent what the real interest is. People will argue for change, but what you need to really understand is what underlies the request for change or the need for change. And I suppose the last factor would be finding ways in which you can collaborate with those stakeholders, how to create value for them that will ultimately end up creating value for the company.
You know, when you were leading the conversation, one of the issues you brought up with a lot of authority and confidence is the need to establish trust between the corporation or the corporation's representative and the stakeholder. Would you say some more about that?
Sure. Trust is a big subject today in every area, whether it's business or government or anywhere else. And I think trust is easily lost between businesses and its stakeholders, and it takes time to develop. The work I like was a book written by Stephen M.R. Covey called The Speed of Trust, where he talks about the behaviors which promote trust and that are needed in order to establish them. For example, on the character side, talking straight to the stakeholders about what the real issues are and the facts as you see them, being respectful of their point of view, hopefully creating a transparent process where they can participate and feel comfortable that the outcomes are ones that will be acceptable to them. Showing loyalty to your stakeholders once a relationship is developed, maintaining that. And I think finally, one of them that I think is important is the idea of extending trust. Not only do we want to build trust, but the best way to find ways for people to trust you is give them the opportunity to and expect that they will be accountable to the things they say they're going to do.
One of the other factors that you mentioned in that category of establishing trust is to make the relationship a face-to-face relationship. And it was going through my mind how many people probably try to do this on emails and voicemails and so on.
Yeah, I think that is a problem today with our social media and the technology we have. It's so easy to send an email or a tweet, as we have seen, And those kinds of communication are not effective, in my opinion, in terms of building the kind of trust relationship I'm talking about. There's something important about people seeing you as a person. That physical image, as well as the opportunity to be face-to-face, is very important in contributing to the trust relationship.
Well, I think you established those ideas very effectively this morning. We had a very good discussion about them as well.
Thank you, Dan.
So, Skip, we've talked about some of the success factors in establishing a good stakeholder engagement relationship. What would you say is the single biggest impediment to a successful stakeholder relationship?
Well, probably, in my mind, the single biggest impediment would be the lack of commitment from the executive level of a company to the values and the ethics of, and the importance of developing stakeholder engagement and involvement in the company. Without that executive support, people will have a hard time believing that you really care about the things that they have an interest in.
How do you go about overcoming that sort of a thing? I know that depends a bit on the organization, but what are some tactics and strategies you can use to get them involved?
Well, probably the first thing you do is, as I mentioned before, is once you've identified who those key stakeholders are, simply sitting down and having the conversation with them about what the interests of your company is or are, and what their interests may be, as in how those interests align themselves. And that can be done at any level in the organization. Executive support is important, as I mentioned, but nevertheless, at any level in the organization, to the extent that stakeholders can see that the company has an interest that is aligned with theirs, they're going to be more likely to provide benefits to the company, and likewise for the company to address the issues that they may have.
Do you find that more senior people in organizations are less likely to have empathy with the stakeholder and be willing to sit down and listen to the stakeholder?
That's a tough one. I'm not sure I can tell you that I can answer that question. Clearly, organizations that have been around a long time, who have developed what I would call a hierarchical structure of responsibility, probably have a little bit more difficult time relating to stakeholders than those organizations that are more current, that are more contemporary in their view. That is, they're more likely to have a penchant to work with people on the outside and to recognize that stakeholders bring that currency of information to them that they're going to need to be successful.
There's a lot to get in the way of effective engagement, and thank you for that good advice. Skip, is a stakeholder engagement process for a corporate social responsibility program very different from stakeholder engagement processes with kind of traditional stakeholders like investors or vendors or customers or employees, or is it kind of the same process?
Yeah, I tend to believe that the stakeholder engagement process itself is very similar. Clearly, in doing a corporate social responsibility project, it's more likely that you would be working with a community organization or a nonprofit, while in the course of normal business, stakeholder engagement with your suppliers and customers may be a much broader involvement that is broader in terms of the subjects that you'll be involved in. So they're similar in that you have to find the common interests, you have to build that trust relationship that's important to the success of any endeavor that you undertake with your stakeholders.
You know, it seems to me, as we discussed during the roundtable discussion, that most corporations, at least publicly traded corporations, have organizations within their company who are assigned the responsibility of maintaining that relationship. For example, an investor relations department or a human resources department looking after the employees, or the marketing and marketing research organization. But for corporate social responsibility, it's often hard to find a group of people who's responsible for that.
Well, corporate social responsibility in some respects is relatively new when you talk about it in terms of sustainability as a concept. And it's a double-edged sword in my mind, because I saw the environmental movement in the early 70s where environment became sort of the key term that everybody felt was important, that they established people to be responsible for the environment. And when one person becomes responsible, then everyone else can be irresponsible. And I think we have somewhat the same issue with corporate social social responsibility, which really goes to talking about how do we make the company more responsive, more current, more relevant to what's going on in the world. If you give that responsibility to one person, everybody else thinks they don't have to worry about it. Now, the positive side, of course, is that when you do have someone who is responsible within the organization, they provide the conscience for the organization to ensure that the subject continues to be in the forefront of the C-suite people and other important people in the organization.
You know, we had two people in our conversation around the table this morning who actually have the job title of Corporate Responsibility Officer. And one is relatively new in the job, and the other is, in fact, no longer in the job because he moved on to something else. Is that a growing phenomenon of having specific senior officers with that title?
Well, I think that it is a natural reaction to people recognizing the importance of the subject, that is, to put somebody in charge of the subject. But as I said, I don't think that's always the best solution. Now, that person undoubtedly will have a responsibility to educate other people in the company, and internally, that education can be probably more effective than if it comes as a pressure from the outside. So to that extent, I think that it happens. Clearly, the most successful companies that do stakeholder engagement in corporate social responsibility are those where the CEO or the C-level manager or C-level officers have the commitment and then provide the leadership in the company to see that it occurs.
Well, that was a major part of the conversation this morning, and thank you for that. Those insights. I think it clarified things for a lot of people. So we learned a lot this morning, Skip, about what contributes to an effective engagement relationship and what can get in the way. Can you share an example, say, of a company who you think has really done this correctly?
Mentioned this morning, and actually I'm going to go back in history to the contributions that a British businesswoman by the name of Anita Roddick brought to the table. She started a company called The Body Shop in 1976, but the company was really committed to social change. She, through her company, did everything from support Greenpeace and trying to stop the killing of the whales to creating a foundation for the lost children of wars and orphans called Children on the Edge. She campaigned to stop animal testing. She promoted fair trade with third world countries. So very much an example of somebody who was engaging stakeholders in a very social way to try to make the society a better place to live.
And I'm of your generation as well, so I remember her, and she's quite an icon in that arena. Can you think of any big successful corporations that are contemporary, maybe like Whole Foods, and how they go about it?
Well, yes. John Mackey, who wrote a book called Conscious Capitalism, talked about how he had an epiphany in recognizing that all stakeholders to a company were important in the success of that company. So they really have gone out of the way to find ways not only to engage stakeholders in the process, but in fact to integrate them into the process through involvement in finding ways to improve the company's success with its customers, developing agreements with its suppliers, using techniques like that to make stakeholders a real part of the company's success rather than giving them information about what the company does.
Yeah, Mackey's been held up as an icon of this movement for some time. So Skip, we've talked about a lot of positive things, a lot of inhibitors and so on. Through all this process, how would you describe what success looks like in terms of CSR stakeholder engagement? I don't know if you can measure it or not, but at least how do you identify successful results?
Well, I've just thought a little bit about that. I think the hard research is yet to come. We have people like John Mackey we talked about who would argue that if a company's product is not selling well anymore, or that the way it deals with its customers or its suppliers lacks responsibility or doesn't provide the same assurance of getting product when they need it, that those are examples of where there are poor stakeholder relations. A good situation is because of the fact that in our society today, technology is changing so quickly. Social media can create things like flash fashions and things of that sort. So if a company doesn't have the channels of open communication with those key stakeholders, the customers and the suppliers and even the community, they may be blindsided, and that is not something companies like, or surprises, because it definitely affects the bottom line and the way people feel about the reputation of the company if they are not, let's say, in line with the way its stakeholders feel that it should be in order to be successful.
Do you expect that we'll see in the future any productive studies about statistical relationships between effective stakeholder management or effective stakeholder engagement and even something as crass as profitability?
Yes, I definitely do, and we heard one mention of it this morning. Because it is still a relatively new subject, people are going to want to be convinced before they make change that this kind of stakeholder engagement and corporate social responsibility will be a payoff. And so, yes, I think we will see those studies, and we will start developing the hard evidence that will make people take a look and make decisions about what's best, how do they deal with the future.
Well, that's encouraging. I'll look forward to seeing that research.
Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business. College of Business.